We are parting forever. It must be so, for we ought never to have met. Well, God be with you." The train moved off rapidly. Its lights soon vanished from sight, and a minute later there was no sound of it, as though everything had conspired together to end as quickly as possible that sweet delirium, that madness. Left alone on the platform and gazing into the dark distance, Gurov listened to the chirrup of the grasshoppers and the hum of the telegraph wires, feeling as though he had only just woke up. And he thought, musing, that there had been another episode or adventure in his life, and it too was at an end, and nothing was left of it but a memory. He was moved, sad, and conscious of a slight remorse. This young woman, whom he would never meet again, had not been happy with him. He was generally warm and affectionate with her, but yet in his manner, his tone, and his caress, there had been a shade of light irony, and the coarse condescension of a man who was besides almost twice her age. All the time, she had called him kind, exceptional, lofty. Obviously, he had seemed to her different from what he really was, so he had unintentionally deceived her. Here at the station was already a scent of autumn. It was a cold evening. "It's time for me to go north," thought Gurov as he left the platform. High time. At home in Moscow, everything was in its winter routine. The stoves were heated, and in the morning it was still dark when the children were having breakfast and getting ready for school, and the nurse would light the lamp for a short time. The frost had begun already. When the first snow has fallen, on the first day of sledge driving, it is pleasant to see the white earth, the white roofs, to draw a soft, delicious breath, and the season brings back the days of one's youth. The old limes and birches, white with hoarfrost, have a good-natured expression. They are nearer to one's heart than cypresses and palms, and near them, one doesn't want to be thinking of the sea and the mountains. Gurov was Moscow-born. He arrived in Moscow on a fine frosty day, and when he put on his fur coat and warm gloves and walked along Petrovka, and when on Saturday evening he heard the ringing of the bells, his recent trip and the places he had seen lost all charm for him. Little by little, he became absorbed in Moscow life, greedily read 3 newspapers a day, and declared he did not read the Moscow papers on principle. He already felt a longing to go to restaurants, clubs, dinner parties, anniversary celebrations, and he felt flattered at entertaining distinguished lawyers and artists, and at playing cards with a professor at the doctor's club. He could already eat a whole plateful of saltfish and cabbage. In another month, he fancied, the image of Anna Sergeyevna would be shrouded in a mist in his memory, and only from time to time would visit him in his dreams with a touching smiles as others did. But more than a month passed, real winter had come, and everything was still clear in his memory, as though he had parted with Anna Sergeyevna only the day before, and his memories glowed more and more vividly. When in the evening stillness he heard from his study the voices of his children preparing their lessons, or when he listened to a song or the organ at the restaurant, or the storm howled in the chimney, suddenly everything would rise up in his memory. What had happened on the Groyne, and the early morning with the mist on the mountains, and the steamer coming from Theodosia, and the kisses. He would pace a long time about his room, remembering it all and smiling. Then his memories passed into dreams, and in his fancy, the past was mingled with what was to come. Anna Sergeyevna did not visit him in his dreams, but followed him about everywhere like a shadow and haunted him. When he shut his eyes, he saw her as though she were living before him, and she seemed to him lovelier, younger, tenderer than she was, and he imagined himself finer than he had been in Yalta. In the evenings, she peeped out at him from the bookcase, from the fireplace, from the corner. He heard her breathing, the caressing rustle of her dress. In the street, he watched the women, looking for someone like her. He was tormented by an intense desire to confide his memories to someone. But in his home, it was impossible to talk of his love, and he had no one outside. He could not talk to his tenants nor to anyone at the bank. And what had he to talk of? Had he been in love then? Had there been anything beautiful, poetical, or edifying, or simply interesting in his relations with Anna Sergeyevna? And there was nothing for him but to talk vaguely of love, of women, and no one guessed what it meant. Only his wife twitched her black eyebrows and said, "The part of a lady killer does not suit you at all, Dmitri." One evening, coming out of the doctor's club with an official with whom he had been playing cards, he could not resist saying, "If only you knew what a fascinating woman I made the acquaintance of in Yalta." The official got into a sledge and was driving away, but turned suddenly and shouted, "Dmitri Dmitrius, what? You were right this evening. The sturgeon was a bit too strong." These words, so ordinary, for some reason moved Guryov to indignation and struck him as degrading and unclean. What savage manners, what people, what senseless nights, what uninteresting, uneventful days. The rage for card playing, the gluttony, the drunkenness, the continual talk always about the same thing. Useless pursuits and conversations, always about the same things, absorb the better part of one's time, the better part of one's strength. And in the end, there is left a life groveling and curtailed, worthless and trivial. And there is no escaping or getting away from it, just as though one were in a madhouse or a prison. Gurov did not sleep all night and was filled with indignation. He had a headache all next day, and the next night he slept badly. He sat up in bed thinking, or paced up and down his room. He was sick of his children, sick of the bank. He had no desire to go anywhere or to talk of anything. In the holidays in December, he prepared for a journey and told his wife he was going to Petersburg to do something in the interest of a young friend, and he set off for S. What for? He did not very well know himself. He wanted to see Anna Sergeyevna and to talk with her, to arrange a meeting if possible. He reached S in the morning and took the best room at the hotel, in which the floor was covered with gray army cloth, and on the table was an inkstand, gray with dust, and adorned with a figure on horseback, with its hat in his hand and its head broken off. The hotel porter gave him the necessary information. Von Diederitz lived in a house of his own in Old Gontcharny Street. It was not far from the hotel. He was rich and lived in good style and had his own horses. Everyone in the town knew him. The porter pronounced the name Diederitz. Gurov went without haste to Old Gontcharny Street and found the house. Just opposite the house stretched a long gray fence adorned with nails. One would run away from a fence like that, thought Gurov, looking from the fence to the windows of the house and back again. He considered today was a holiday, and the husband would probably be at home. And in any case, it would be tactless to go into the house and upset her. If he were to send her a note, it might fall into her husband's hands, and then it might ruin everything. The best thing was to trust to chance, and he kept walking up and down the street by the fence, waiting for the chance. He saw a beggar go in at the gate, and dogs fly at him. Then an hour later, he heard a piano, and the sounds were faint and indistinct. Probably it was Anna Sergeyevna playing. The front door suddenly opened, and an old woman came out, followed by the familiar white Pomeranian. Gurov was on the point of calling to the dog, but his heart began beating violently, and in his excitement, he could not remember the dog's name. He walked up and down and loathed the gray fence more and more, and by now he thought irritably that Anna Sergeyevna had forgotten him and was perhaps already amusing herself with someone else, and that was very natural in a young woman who had nothing to look at from morning till night but that confounded fence. He went back to his hotel room and sat for a long while on the sofa, not knowing what to do. Then he had dinner and a long nap. How stupid and worrying it is, he thought, when he woke and looked at the dark windows. It was already evening. Here I've had a good sleep for some reason. What shall I do in the night? He sat on the bed, which was covered by a cheap gray blanket, such as one sees in hospitals, and he taunted himself in his vexation. So much for the lady with the dog, so much for the adventure. You're in a nice fix. That morning at the station, a poster in large letters had caught his eye. The geisha was to be performed for the first time. He thought of this and went to the theater. It's quite possible she may go to the first performance, he thought. The theater was full. As in all provincial theaters, there was a fog above the chandelier. The gallery was noisy and restless. In the front row, the local dandies were standing up before the beginning of the performance with their hands behind them. In the governor's box, the governor's daughter, wearing a boa, was sitting in the front seat, while the governor himself lurked modestly behind the curtain with only his hands visible. The orchestra was a long time tuning up. The stage curtain swayed. All the time the audience were coming in and taking their seats, Gurov looked at them eagerly. Anna Sergeyevna too came in. She sat down in the third row, and when Gurov looked at her, his heart contracted, and he understood clearly that for him there was in the whole world no creature so near, so precious, and so important to him. She, this little woman, in no way remarkable, lost in a provincial crowd, with a vulgar lorgnette in her hand, filled his whole life now, was his sorrow and his joy, the one happiness that he now desired for himself, and to the sounds of the inferior orchestra, of the wretched provincial violins, he thought how lovely she was. He thought and dreamed. A young man with small side whiskers, tall and stooping, came in with Anna Sergeyevna and sat down beside her. He bent his head at every step and seemed to be continually bowing. Most likely this was the husband whom at Yalta, in a rush of bitter feeling, she had called a flunky. And there really was in his long figure, his side whiskers, and the small bald patch on his head, something of the flunky's obsequiousness. His smile was sugary, and in his bottom hole there was some badge of distinction like the number on a waiter. During the first interval, the husband went away to smoke. She remained alone in her stall. Gurov, who was sitting in the stalls too, went up to her and said in a trembling voice with a forced smile, "Good evening." She glanced at him and turned pale, then glanced again with horror, unable to believe her eyes, and tightly gripped the fan and the lorgnette in her hands, evidently struggling with herself not to faint. Both were silent. She was sitting, he was standing, frightened by her confusion and not venturing to sit down beside her. The violins and the flute began tuning up. He felt suddenly frightened. It seemed as though all the people in the boxes were looking at them. She got up and went quickly to the door. He followed her, and both walked senselessly along passages and up and down stairs, and figures in legal, scholastic, and civil service uniforms, all wearing badges, flitted before their eyes. They caught glimpses of ladies, of fur coats hanging on pegs. The draughts blew on them, bringing a smell of stale tobacco. And Gurov, whose heart was beating violently, thought, "Oh heavens, why are these people here, and this orchestra?" And at that instant, he recalled when he had seen Anna Sergeyevna off at the station. He had thought that everything was over, and they would never meet again. But how far they were still far from the end. On the narrow, gloomy staircase over which was written, "To the amphitheater," she stopped. "How you have frightened me," she said, breathing hard, still pale and overwhelmed. "Oh, how you have frightened me. I am half dead. Why have you come? Why?" "But do understand, Anna, do understand," he said hastily in a low voice. "I entreat you to understand." She looked at him with dread, with entreaty, with love. She looked at him intently, to keep his features more distinctly in her memory. "I am so unhappy," she went on, not heeding him. "I have thought of nothing but you all the time. I live only in the thought of you. And I wanted to forget you. But why, oh why have you come?" On the landing above them, 2 schoolboys were smoking and looking down. But that was nothing to Gurov. He drew Anna Sergeyevna to him and began kissing her face, her cheeks, and her hands. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" she cried in horror, pushing him away. "We are mad. Go away today. Go away at once. I beseech you by all that is sacred. I implore you. There are people coming this way." Someone was coming up the stairs. "You must go away," Anna Sergeyevna went on in a whisper. "Do you hear, Dmitri Dmitrius? I will come and see you in Moscow. I have never been happy. I am miserable now, and I never, never shall be happy. Never. Don't make me suffer still more. I swear I'll come to Moscow. But now let us part. My precious, good, dear one, we must part." She pressed his hand and began rapidly going downstairs, looking round at him. And from her eyes, he could see that she really was unhappy. Gurov stood for a little while, listened. Then, when all sound had died away, he found his coat and left the theater. And Anna Sergeyevna began coming to see him in Moscow. Once in 2 or 3 months she left S, telling her husband that she was going to consult a doctor about an internal complaint, and her husband believed her and did not believe her. In Moscow, she stayed at the Slaviansky Bazaar Hotel and at once sent a man in a red cap to Gurov. Gurov went to see her, and no one in Moscow knew of it. Once he was going to see her in this way on a winter morning. The messenger had come the evening before when he was out. With him walked his daughter, whom he wanted to take to school. It was on the way. Snow was falling in big wet flakes. "It's 3 degrees above freezing point, and yet it is snowing," said Gurov to his daughter. "The thaw is only on the surface of the earth. There is quite a different temperature at a greater height in the atmosphere." "And why are there no thunderstorms in the winter, father?" He explained that too. He talked, thinking all the while that he was going to see her, and no living soul knew of it, and probably never would know. He had 2 lives, one open, seen and known by all who cared to know, full of relative truth and of relative falsehood, exactly like the lives of his friends and acquaintances, and another life running its course in secret. And through some strange, perhaps accidental conjunction of circumstances, everything that was essential, of interest, and of value to him, everything in which he was sincere and did not deceive himself, everything that made the kernel of his life, was hidden from other people. And all that was false in him, the sheath in which he hid himself to conceal the truth, such for instance as his work in the bank, his discussions at the club, his lower race, his presence with his wife at anniversary festivities, all that was open. And he judged of others by himself, not believing in what he saw, and always believing that every man had his real, most interesting life under the cover of secrecy and under the cover of night. All personal life rested on secrecy, and possibly it was partly on that account that civilized man was so nervously anxious that personal privacy should be respected. After leaving his daughter at school, Gurvan went on to the Slaviansky Bazaar. He took off his fur coat below, went upstairs, and softly knocked at the door. Anna Sergeyevna, wearing his favorite gray dress, exhausted by the journey and the suspense, had been expecting him since the evening before. She was pale. She looked at him and did not smile, and he had hardly come in when she fell on his breast. Their kiss was slow and prolonged, as though they had not met for 2 years. "Well, how are you getting on there?" he asked. "What's news?" "Wait, I'll tell you directly. I can't talk." She could not speak. She was crying. She turned away from him and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. Let her have her cry out. I'll sit down and wait, he thought, and he sat down in an armchair. Then he rang and asked for tea to be brought him. And while he drank his tea, she remained standing at the window with her back to him. She was crying from emotion, from the miserable consciousness that their life was so hard for them. They could only meet in secret, hiding themselves from people like thieves. Was not their life shattered? "Come, do stop," he said. It was evident to him that this love of theirs would not soon be over, that he could not see the end of it. Anna Sergeyevna grew more and more attached to him. She adored him, and it was unthinkable to say to her that it was bound to have an end someday. Besides, she would not have believed it. He went up to her and took her by the shoulders to say something affectionate and cheering. And at that moment, he saw himself in the looking-glass. His hair was already beginning to turn gray, and it seemed strange to him that he had grown so much older, so much plainer during the last few years. The shoulders on which his hands rested were warm and quivering. He felt passion for this life, still so warm and lovely, but probably already not far from beginning to fade and wither like his own. Why did she love him so much? He always seemed to women different from what he was, and they loved in him not himself, but the man created by their imagination, whom they had been eagerly seeking all their lives. And afterwards, when they noticed their mistake, they loved him all the same, and not one of them had been happy with him. Time passed. He had made their acquaintance, got on with them, parted, but had never once loved. It was anything you like, but not love. And only now, when his head was gray, he had fallen properly, really in love for the first time in his life. Anna Sergeyevna and he loved each other like people very close and akin, like husband and wife, like tender friends. It seemed to them that fate itself had meant them for one another, and they could not understand why he had a wife and she a husband. And it was as though they were a pair of birds of passage, caught and forced to live in different cages. They forgave each other for what they were ashamed of in their past. They forgave everything in the present and felt that this love of theirs had changed them both. In moments of depression in the past, he had comforted himself with any arguments that came into his mind. But now, he no longer cared for arguments. He felt profound compassion. He wanted to be sincere and tender. "Don't cry, my darling," he said. "You've had your cry. That's enough. Let us talk now. Let us think of some plan." Then they spent a long while talking counsel together, talked of how to avoid the necessity for secrecy, for deception, for living in different towns and not seeing each other for long at a time. How could they be free from this intolerable bondage? How, he asked, clutching his head. How? And it seemed as though in a little while the solution would be found, and then a new and splendid life would begin. And it was clear to both of them that they had still a long, long road before them, and that the most complicated and difficult part of it was only just beginning.